Okay, we might have a couple other people coming in and out, so, and I know some of you need to maybe leave a little bit early, so that's okay as well. Stay for as much as you can. So I really, first of all, I appreciate each and every one of you coming out here on a Friday. Now, some people already work on Fridays, but some people don't, so I appreciate this as a personal favor, as I said in my email. And I hope in return that you'll get something useful out of today, maybe at least one strategy or idea that you could use with your own students. So let me give you a little intro as to what we're up to today. The title of this workshop is Beyond the Sage on the Stage, Student-Centered Learning Strategies. All of the strategies that we're going to be using today come from the on-course series of text manuals and workshops you may or may not heard of, developed by Dr. Skip Downing, who was a professor for something like 30 years over at Baltimore State Community College, and Dr. Jonathan Brennan, who teaches currently over at Mission College. And on-course was an approach that was actually introduced to me quite a few years ago by my teaching mentor over at Modesto Junior College, Deborah Gilbert, who was really excited about it and using it with her classes. And I'm afraid at the time I didn't bother to adopt it. I was kind of only half listening to her. I wish I listened, because subsequently when I came across it 6 or 7 years later, I was really excited about some of the strategies. I started going to some of the workshops, and now I'm taking a graduate course with Dr. Downing through the University of Wisconsin online. So that's what this project is. It's sort of a work in progress, this workshop, so sort of bear with me if there's some bumps along the way. There's obviously a lot more to OnCourse, but just the two main purposes of the OnCourse approach. And Patrick, you're going to need one of these. Thank you. To provide educators, first of all, with learner-centered structures and strategies for helping students to learn more deeply. So trying to move away from the idea of standing up there lecturing and students are just going to be these receptacles of the knowledge that we're trying to give them, because I think all of us know in one degree to another that that isn't really working in the 21st century. So learner-centered structures and strategies, really putting some planning and thought into how you're making students co-educators in the process of the classroom and outside of the classroom. And number two, sort of a parallel thread to OnCourse, which we'll also be looking at today, empowerment strategies for helping students become active, responsible, and successful learners, because you can set up all the learner-centered structures and strategies that you want, but if students aren't taking a proactive role in their education, if they're not being responsible about their own education, none of that stuff is going to work. So there are these kind of parallel threads of students driving their own education, but then they have to have the responsibility to be sort of a co-pilot in that process. A key approach towards accomplishing these goals, and where the title of this workshop comes from, is the idea of, whenever possible, trying to move away from traditional lecturing, trying to move away from the idea that we as educators are the sage on the stage who dispenses information and the students are going to dutifully take notes and learn everything that they want them to, and moving instead towards structured collaborative learning, emphasis on structured. We started circling back around today, all the things that we're going to be looking at. There's been some time and thought put into them, and I think sometimes collaborative learning gets a bad reputation among some instructors because they think, well, you're just kind of throwing students together in groups and hoping that something happens. But real collaborative learning, you might spend more time and energy putting together those structures than you would with a traditional lecture. So it's not a way of getting out of work as far as the educator. What does the research say? Just to dip our toe into that a little bit. The quotes and information I'm going to give you over the next couple of minutes come from Collaborative Learning Techniques, a handbook for college faculty by Barclay, Cross, and Major, available in the Merced College Library if you want to check it out later. This has been a key text for me this semester, in addition to the assigned text for my graduate course. I wrote a book review on it for the class, and it's very helpful in terms of actual techniques, but also research on collaborative learning. There's lots of research in the first 100 pages of this book. I'm just going to give you a couple of ideas. The research of Pasquarella at the University of Iowa, and Terenzini, who works with him but is at the Pennsylvania State University. They did a massive study of 2,500 education articles, reports, and books, better than me, to put together their evaluation, how college affects students. And they concluded that structured group work, with structured group work, students not only make statistically significant gains in factual knowledge equal to or better than traditional lecture, but they also change on a broad array of values, attitudinal, psychosocial, and moral dimensions. So that sort of their development as adults or as citizens in a democracy is also impacted by group work. And I think in particular, these sorts of values and dimensions, if we're going to be honest, it's hard for students to gain out of those just from sitting in a lecture and taking some notes. So group work has the added benefit of coming at the student in an entirely different way. You might be familiar with the work of Dr. Alexander Aston, who's now a professor emeritus of higher education and organizational change at UCLA. In his review of the research on cooperative learning approaches, he concluded that such approaches produce outcomes that are actually superior to those obtained through traditional competitive approaches, such as sitting in a lecture and taking notes and then taking a test and trying to get the highest grade in the class or a curve or something like that. And of course, his research is much more in depth. I'm just giving you the briefest hint of it. But he concluded that cooperative learning may be more potent than traditional methods of pedagogy because it motivates students to become more active and more involved participants in the learning process. So they see themselves as co-educators along with their professor, and therefore, ideally, they're becoming more active. They see themselves as part of that process, and they value their education more rather than just being passive recipients of this knowledge, which they can then get, regurgitate an exam, and be done with it. Sort of becomes part of them a little bit more. So some faculty, of course, though, as we know, and some of us on some occasions, even me, once in a while, are still sort of resistant to collaborative learning. Why would that be? Well, Dr. Carl Smith is a professor of engineering, but also a subject I didn't know existed, engineering education at Minnesota and Purdue University. And he concludes that what ends up happening is that collaborative learning or group work gets a bad name because it's not really structured. Professors will simply put their students together in groups and kind of hope that magic happens, and that's just simply not going to work. So he points out there's a crucial difference between simply putting students in groups to learn and structuring cooperation among the students, which again takes time and energy on your part, but pays big dividends ultimately through the educational process. And he points out that in truly well-structured collaborative learning, teamwork skills should be taught just as purposefully and precisely as academic skills. As we all know, those are skills that are valued out in the work world increasingly in the 21st century. So students are also getting those sort of soft skills that they can use out in the world as well. So that was just sort of setting the stage for all this work. Today, our goals are going to be a little bit more modest. What I want to do from the beginning is simply get you thinking about your own feelings and ideas, what you're coming in with regarding collaborative learning and student-centered learning. And also, as I said at the outset, I want to model some approaches that perhaps you could use with your students so you could have that immediate takeaway. And if you're interested in any of these particular strategies, I can give you additional handouts or send you something in the future if you'd like to use them. So the first question that's going to guide us, and we're going to start getting you involved as students in this process. The first activity is designed around this question. Can you identify your own feelings about and reactions to student-centered learning and collaborative learning? What are you coming to this discussion with in terms of your existing thoughts and feelings on that? So I know we had a couple people come in. You're going to need these packets up here. So if you want to come up and grab one of those. Everyone who already has a packet, if you could make sure you're on the first handout that says Teaching and Learning Opinions. Teaching and Learning Opinions. It looks like this. So on the handout, we have here listed below a series of statements made by authors, made by educators, but also statements that were reported by attendees at various on-course workshops led by Dr. Downing or led by Dr. Brennan. And what I'd like to do before our activity is to actually just read these out loud. And I'd like to use the popcorn reading method if you're familiar with that. So if you're not, what happens is that one person reads a statement out loud, and when they're done, whoever in the room is comfortable doing so reads the next one. So we just kind of fill in the space as one person finishes reading. We don't necessarily go in any particular order. So we have 9 of these statements. I'll read the first one, and then if people could step in and fill that gap until we get done with all 9. So the first statement from Carl R. Rogers, a psychologist: the only kind of learning which significantly influences behavior is self-discovered or self-appropriated learning, truth that has been assimilated in experience.
Self-discovery is very laudatory, but if we overdid that in science and engineering, we would still be in the pre-industrial age.
The biggest enemy to learning is the talking teacher.
My office mate and I both teach literature. He does a lot of activities and group work in his class. I lecture. Last semester I covered twice as much of the text as he did. To be honest, I think his students are being cheated out of a rigorous education.
Our second worst assumption as teachers is that if we don't cover something in class, the students won't learn it. Our worst assumption is that if we do, they will.
Top teachers see themselves as facilitators of learning, as opposed to conduits of knowledge.
Discussion is a problem in mathematics. Exercises and problems have one correct answer, and it's the instructor's job to show students the correct way to get to it. No opinion. Only at the graduate level is there room for different approaches.
It is not what you say to people that counts. It is what you have them do. If most teachers have not yet grasped this idea, it is not for lack of evidence.